Welcome. I'm Scott Hodge, president of the Tax Foundation, and welcome to another of the Tax Foundation's Talking Tax webinars. During our last Talking Tax webinar, we tackled the heated debate between the United States and other countries over how and where large digital companies should be taxed and how those decisions might affect U.S. companies and the U.S. Treasury. Today, we're going to stay a little closer to home and have what in baseball terms you might call a double header, back-to-back panels on what lies ahead for coronavirus relief at both the federal and state levels. This program is certainly timely as negotiations between Congress and the White House have begun in earnest over a Phase 4 package of relief. These negotiations will certainly focus on many of the topics that we'll discuss today, such as how to provide liquidity to struggling businesses and how should lawmakers address state budget shortfalls. Before we introduce our first panel, let me touch on a few housekeeping items. We want to make this an interactive program, and so here's how we can you can submit your questions. And I should note that the program is being recorded so that you can come back later and watch it again or pass it along to your colleagues and friends. But do include your name and organization and include the name of the panelists that you may want to direct your questions to. And you can see all of these directions at the bottom of your screen. So we do welcome your questions and look forward to that after our formal presentations in a few minutes. Well, let's begin our program with our first panel and topic. Currently, the main source of liquidity for businesses today is the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP as they call it, which is run through the Small Business Administration. And according to our friends at the American Action Forum and their tally, lawmakers have approved nearly $660 billion for the PPP program, and SBA has dispersed over $520 billion of those funds. Well, despite these and other assistance programs, we are still seeing headlines such as this one recently in the New York Times, quote, "Coronavirus surge is killing America's small businesses." The web service Yelp has reported that nearly 66,000 businesses under its umbrella have folded since March 1st. A Harvard study says the number could be closer to 110,000. Another recent report last weekend found that 41% of Black-owned businesses, some 440,000 enterprises, have been shuttered by the COVID-19, and nearly half may never reopen. You know, and even these figures don't include the growing number of large firms that have filed for bankruptcy recently, many of them large retailers or even rental car companies such as Hertz. So these issues raise a ton of questions for our panelists today. What more can Congress do to help provide liquidity to these struggling businesses? How should negotiators think about these issues? What are the trade-offs that they need to consider when designing a Phase 4 relief package? And then there's the tension between short-term and long-term measures. Should restoring liquidity to struggling businesses in the short term be mutually exclusive to the policies that will ensure long-term economic growth? And are there policies that will achieve both of these goals? Well, we've got an excellent panel to address these issues in our first session. First up and setting the stage for us will be Laura Yamanaka, who is board chair of the National Association of Women Business Owners Institute for Entrepreneurial Development. And then next up will be Justin Field, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Venture Capital Association. And then batting cleanup is our own Carl Smith, Tax Foundation Vice President for Federal Tax and Economic Policy. Well, I'm delighted that all of you can join us today, you in the audience and you on the panel. Laura, let's get the conversation started. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate the chance to come and speak and share a little bit about what's happening in Los Angeles and the nation through NAWBO. and then also to give everybody a feel for what's actually happening on the ground. So my day job, as I said, is team CFO. What we do is we provide outsourced CFO and controllership services for small and mid-sized businesses. We define small businesses as 3 million to like 50 million. And I know that leaves out a huge chunk of businesses, but I will address them too. It's been a very, very tough time on the ground, as all of you might have imagined. All those headlines, I think, are nice little blurbs of what's happening at individual companies across the nation. And I think you see more of the impact on the small to mid-sized businesses than the large, even though we've had encouraged our clients to start building up the cash reserves because we had felt that a recession was coming. I don't think anybody was prepared for the rapid deterioration of business. Even when I look back to 2008 recession back then, it was much more gradual. So many clients right now are seeing the spigot turn off, just off. Even if they weren't immediately impacted or their clients weren't immediately impacted, there's caution and concern, right? And everybody is just like, whoa, we're going to go to the grocery store, buy toilet paper and everything else. We're going to put on pause until we can decide what we're going to do. So it's caused most businesses to pivot hard into either moving towards a virtual remote support or to see how long they can stay afloat. The CARES Act and PPP, first I want to say, thank you, and it was great. I mean, we needed to inject that liquidity into the economy as soon as possible. Execution, as with anything, right? Devil's in the details. One of the facts, Scott, you brought up was that small businesses are failing at such a high rate. What we found is even among our business levels, which are about 3 million, in revenue size, though the expertise needed to navigate the PPP, filings, how to get the money, what were the guidelines, what were they signing up for, how to, go to a bank, the SBA, whatever. It was hard. It was really, really hard. It was hard for us, and we're accountants, right? And we're calling up each other, trying to figure out, what bank is telling us what, who got through to the SBA, how do they think it's going to work? And there were a lot of changes that were made because it probably went out too well. There were a lot of changes that were rapidly being made. So frustration for a lot of our clients was those who had the expertise or could hire people to deal with it kept saying, how come this keeps changing? How come we keep doing it? How come I can't just try to figure out how to get my business up and running without you keeping asking me about going back for my payroll records for 2019, right? And having the different layers. So there was a lot of frustration and a lot of time that was taken away from, quote unquote, trying to figure out how to run their business in the new reality and spending time. It might not have taken money. It didn't cost to apply for the PPP loans. But if they didn't have somebody helping them, or even if they did, it took a lot of resources within the company to actually pull together the information, make an educated guess, and hope you get that money. It was also pretty evident that your banking relationships were really super critical during that time. And it's something we always share with our clients. You got to be close with the bank, but even all of the banks were pretty much slammed just as hard with all the things that they had to do to get that money out. I think that if you look at what's happening now with our clients, the PPP funds just gave them a little bit of breathing room. And particularly here in California, since we're surging again and we're on the verge of a lockdown and had some reopening, things changed back. Our businesses and across the US are realizing that things can change again rapidly. It looks like it's opening up. It may not. And as you all know, one of the most important concepts to business is our ability to predict, to model, and to see what are the different scenarios that as a business owner we have to be prepared for. And that is causing many businesses really do not have that capacity. And those that do, it's hard to predict from going to like nothing to, wow, if you're in certain businesses, you could be doing really well. We have businesses who are theoretically doing well in this economy, but they can't get paid. So even though their revenues look good, they'll pay taxes on it if we don't have to work something out, and they won't have anything to pay their taxes or their people with. So I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have going forward is to figure out how to get some stability and predictability. I'm not saying it's going to be good predictability, but at least people know how to prepare and what their scenarios are and what their options are moving forward. I think that when they're doing that, we have to realize that the majority of small businesses do not have that talent in-house, nor can they afford it because they don't have the cash. And so when we're enacting any kind of legislation or support, we're probably leaving out a great component or large number of small businesses who just do not have the resources to be able to take advantage of these programs. And I know I've been really focused on the short term, but there is some sense that we need to move towards understanding how is business going to be reacting in the medium and long term. Because again, when you're making decisions on liquidity in the short term, if you knew that your business was going to be substantially changed, you did not have the capital capacity to change the business to what needs to occur, then maybe your options aren't good. And maybe you should just cut your losses and move out now. Many of our clients are trying to figure out what their business is going to look like in the long run. And as a result, having to be prepared to pivot immediately in timeframes they never thought was possible. I will say this, this situation has, on the positive side, demonstrated to many clients that they are able to move much more quickly than they thought they did. They're also shown that they're able to make decisions without a lot of modeling and spreadsheets. Now, in the long run, we don't know what's going to happen, but at least they're moving. They're doing their best to try to survive for the short run and the long run. I think it's also pointed out that it's given an opportunity for businesses to really rethink how can they deliver their services and what kind of costs are they going to continue to incur, want to continue to incur. And unfortunately, that has meant a culling of employees and figuring out, is automation a better way to do things versus how they were doing it before. So a lot of jobs aren't going to be coming back, at least from what we see. They've figured out a way. In fact, I was speaking to a client last night. He said he figured out a way where he could eliminate 50% of his employees and still kind of get to the same level. He said it's not perfect, but it's 80, 90%. In his world, that was like, that was a huge win. People on the liquidity piece, it's very hard because the normal sources of liquidity, client and customer payments, banking loans are not very reliable at this point, if non-existent in certain industries. And you understand that the customers don't have the money to pay, or they're holding on to their money. The banks are concerned because, well, I don't have to say anything to this group. So they're living off the PPP money, but that has a finite amount. The moving things to the 24 weeks, all of those things help, but people are concerned at this point, and particularly, like I said, states that are who do not feel the COVID is under control are pulling back again. And this time the question is, we don't think it's going to turn around right away. how long can I last? And is this a good choice? So it sounds like it's pretty grim down here on the bottom. It sounds like I'm really supporting all of those headlines that you've seen out there. I just want people to realize that every time you see something in the news like that, or the headlines or the data, those are people with real businesses, and they have children, and they have mortgages they're not paying, and they have employees who are having, not able to put dinner on the table sometimes. So while I speak about the business concerns, and absolutely, and we have to think about advocacy and think we can't save everybody, but who can we save? Where can we put the best bang for our buck in making sure that the economy turns and is able to continually predict where it's going? So predictability and stability, my watchwords, if I could have one wish. Thanks, Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for that very, very realistic and honest on-the-ground report. And I look forward to chatting in the Q&A. You've raised some issues that I wanted to maybe address a little more in depth. And now we'll kick it over to Justin Field and get a different side of the perspective from the investment side. Justin, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, and thanks everyone for having me on today. Really appreciate it. Think you all are do great work, and appreciate the ability to have this timely conversation. I thought Laura put a lot of this very well, and from the investor side, I think there's a lot of similar sentiment. The unpredictability of this is incredibly challenging. I think, especially when you consider the fact that the programs, take PPP for instance, PPP was designed to be a bridge 2 months to a better, solution to the public health crisis. And it's one of these things where the policymakers could have been right in their design of the program, but unforeseen circumstances have put them in a position where PPP could both have been effective and still be needed to do more given the current environment. And that's not even to say, none of us know how this virus is going to react, but what about the chances of a fall snapback? How do you factor that into the decisions that you have to make to invest, to retain employees, to find those opportunities, et cetera? So obviously, I think they're going to have to take a look at the programs, even the ones that were successful, and think about how to modernize them given the current environment that we're in, and look towards what is likely to be a longer haul. Because I think the one recommendation I would say to policymakers is prepare for the long term and be happy if it's shorter, right? Because that's a whole lot better than the converse. And Scott, I thought you brought up a really good point, given where we are today, the short-term relief versus the long-term competitiveness. And at some point in time, I completely agree with you. I think policymakers probably have to stop thinking so much about short-term relief and start thinking about, what, we're in this is going to be tough. We have to start thinking about how to position the country for a long-term recovery from this, because nothing will be the same on the other side. There's no doubt. And it's something that we are watching very closely at NBCA, because we are seeing other countries come up with a number of different relief programs that are designed towards trying to take the mantle of American leadership and innovation. This is something that's been going on for a long time already. 20 years ago, 90% of global venture capital investment came into the United States. We created the industry. We owned it for a very long time. In the course of 20 years, that's gone from 90% of global venture capital. Last year is 50%. So we were in a dogfight before this started, and there's no guarantee that we're going to come out on the other end as the leaders in quantum computing, in AI, and machine learning, and advanced biotech. All these sorts of things that are going to determine the next decades of innovation leadership are, for the first time in my lifetime, are a question as to whether or not American companies will be at the forefront. And so we really are in a fight. And one thing we've been having a lot of conversations on is, how do you ensure that you do the short-term liquidity bridges, but also think about making sure that those companies that are going to be the determinants for our long-term competitiveness can survive and can get the resources they need in an environment where governments across the world are providing that kind of support to their innovative startups. We had some challenges in the startup ecosystem with PPP and the Main Street Loan Program. PPP, for a number of different reasons, ended up being a poor fit to this model. If you think about what a startup is, where it starts small, but it's competing against large incumbents, so it looks larger relative to your more traditional Main Street small businesses. But it also isn't profitable because it's taking investment capital to conduct research, to build out facilities, to do those sorts of long-term growth activities that we separately seek to encourage. So because the Main Street Loan Program has a profitability test, they're completely locked out of that. They couldn't really fit into PPP. And so we're having a lot of conversations now about what can you do for these companies going forward, because this is a sustained slump. We are seeing a move away from liquidity in the startup ecosystem. We wrote a paper called The Capital Crunch is Coming to the Startup Ecosystem a couple months ago, trying to predict what the impact of COVID would be on startup investment. And we've just gotten the first set of numbers back. What we've seen is about 25% drop in startup investment, which is actually better than we thought it was going to be, except when you look through those numbers, what you see is that the later stage, closer to going public companies are sustaining their investment. It's really where folks are getting hurt are the earlier stage startups and the off the coast startups, because you don't have the same sort of in-person interaction. So access to capital for those higher risk, earlier stage companies is becoming far more difficult than it was pre-COVID. So we're particularly worried about that, and we're particularly worried about policymakers kind of missing that point, because the broader numbers are obfuscated by large financing rounds for the later stage private companies, and a somewhat surprisingly resilient IPO market that up to now at least has kept the doors open for folks being able to go public. We do expect if this continues, that 25% number will get worse. In the 2009 recession, we saw about a 60% drop in startup investment. And there's no reason that we couldn't see that again, especially if we do see this drag on into the fall. As you all know, investors generally tend to, during an economic crisis, shift their investment portfolio away from high risk and illiquid, which is what startups and small businesses look like on an investment portfolio, and towards lower risk and more liquid investments. And so we are hearing stories from our venture investors. It's harder to fundraise. We are hearing from our earlier stage companies, it's harder to raise capital, and they all have to make these decisions. I thought Laura made had a really good illustration in her point about, how businesses have to think about this sort of thing with the known unknowns of a pandemic. And I think the story that Laura put out is as applicable in the business she was talking about as any high growth startup in software, hardware, biotechnology, et cetera. The only layer of complexity I would put on that is, in addition, even in good years, these companies are built to lose money in the short term. And so when they have to make these decisions, they have to make decisions not just on a loss of revenues, but they have to make decisions on a potential loss of investment capital down the line. There's a common term that's used in the startup ecosystem called runway. And that what that means is generally how much money do you have in the bank and how far out can you go with that money with current operations. So, if you're spending $10,000 a month, for instance, and you have $60,000 in the bank, that means you have 6 months of runway. In the startup world, really the only way to extend runway generally is to lay people off, because it's a very employment heavy, really very payroll heavy type of business model. And folks who were making the decisions based upon PPP or, that sort of metric of we'll be in this for 3 months, 4 months, they made those decisions several months ago to extend their runway to make up for that. Well, now you got to make a whole different set of decisions, and how that's made and what happens. I'm certainly concerned about what we're going to see going into the fall in terms of activity in startups and what the tough decisions they're going to have to make to stay liquid. And so we're really hoping that this next round of economic relief will think about that unique model and help encourage more investment into the high risk types of companies that drive our long-term economic growth. And so, Scott, your point on short-term versus long-term, which I thought was very well taken. I think there are also things you can do that can provide short-term liquidity that will also bolster our long-term competitiveness. And I'll put a couple of things out there that we're following very closely. Number one is monetization of tax assets. We thought the CARES Act NOL provision, which is something that's been used by both parties for several decades as a sort of tried and true economic relief measure, is a very wise way to do it. In essence, it's a low or no interest loan to companies to try to keep the doors open and keep liquidity in the bank accounts. Because it relied on previous year's profits to cabin the value of the monetization, it doesn't work for the startup ecosystem because startups don't have profits. In some cases, such as biotechnology, medical device, they don't even have revenues because they're under FDA processes, so they can't sell product until they get approval. So we're hoping that we can look at that model of monetizing tax assets, which is a very effective model and has been used effectively in previous recessions, but tailor it to the startup and small business model as well by picking, instead of previous year's profits, a number. We posited $100 million in NOLs, for instance, with the idea being that $100 million at the 21% corporate rate would be about $21 million, a rough justice loan maximum in between PPP's $10 million max and Main Street's $25 million max. And one of the great advantages to that is that you take the middleman out of this process. You no longer have to worry about banking relationships, who's in line, where, et cetera. The tax code is actually a very efficient way to deliver this type of relief. It's all quantifiable. These are all audited books, et cetera. And so we think it's actually a much more efficient mechanism to deliver relief to these companies than a program that is routed through the banks. We were also excited to see the House Ways and Means Committee Republicans release a series of proposals related to monetizing the research and development credit, enhancing the value of the research and development credit for research into COVID products to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, a safe harbor from net operating loss limitation rules that will improve the valuation of long-term capital-intensive, research-intensive companies, especially those in the cutting-edge fields like quantum computing, et cetera, where we are having a long-term fight to figure out who will be the country that leads in those areas. And we're hopeful that move by House Republicans shines a light on this type of model and these types of proposals and gets them into the mix for CARES for consideration. Just a couple other things before I turn back. I know I'm taking too much time, and I apologize. But two other things we're watching very closely are the monetization of general business credits as well. That's a much broader coalition, but included in that would be R&D credits, and that's something that I think would help a lot of innovative companies. And so we are keeping an eye on where that would go. Although from our perspective, net operating losses are actually far more valuable. Most of the companies that I've talked to, it's almost a 10-to-1 ratio, if not more, in terms of the value inherent in the NOLs rather than the R&D credit. So the NOLs are the game changer, but make no mistake, R&D credits would be helpful as well. And also the employee retention tax credit. It was something that got, I think, lost in the mix in PPP. Certainly the stories that I heard about it were folks had a little bit of once bitten, twice shy in dealing with the federal government on PPP and the shifting standards there. The infamous FAQ 31 about other sources of liquidity and things like that. And so when I started, poking people and saying, hey, you should look at the employee retention credit, there just wasn't a lot of trust to spend a bunch of time on another government program when they felt so burned digging into the last one. But the numbers that folks are talking about could potentially make this one very worthwhile. You're talking about, moving the total credit from $5,000 to $36,000, the total employee size from 100 employees to 1,500 employees. And you're getting into potential PPP level liquidity if it comes off as some of the numbers that we're seeing. So despite the skepticism, I would encourage folks to keep a very close eye on the discussions around the employee retention credit, because we do think that for some companies who have a revenue-based model, and that's not everybody, but for folks who are running a revenue-based model, that could be an efficient source of liquidity that is in the mix of things. So maybe I'll just stop there and let y'all go to the rest, and happy to take questions on that.
Thank you, Justin. That's really interesting. I'll be interested in the Q&A to see Laura's response to some of those suggestions, because I noticed her nodding her head during your presentation. So, but we'll kick it over to Carl to bring us on home. And Carl, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Scott. So as Scott talked about at Tax Foundation, we're thinking a lot about how to balance short-term needs with long-term growth. And so in particular, I think this next package has a lot of challenges. And there are three challenges that lawmakers face. Number one, they have to deal with the immediate crisis, which is changing, as we speak. They have to set the stage for recovery, and they have to avoid getting trapped in partisan gridlock. And so I want to talk a little bit why I think those aren't just general challenges, but right here, right now, are particular challenges that we have to overcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas that have been floated so far and how well they do on the metrics of balancing short-term versus long-term. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we think might be some ways to break through. Okay, so up until a few weeks ago, it seemed that the acute phase of the crisis might have been coming to a close. As most people know, hospitalizations are now rising to levels on par with those seen in April. We still see that deaths are lagging around the country. We hope that they stay low. There are reasons to think that they might stay low. We have new treatments. We have a different age profile. But when you think about economic policy, it has to prepare for the worst, which means more lockdowns, but more importantly, more household and business retrenchment. So a point that I try to make is even if governors want to keep their states open, we saw most of the decline in activity happen even before the lockdowns. And so if the health crisis rises, there's almost no way to avoid a strong retrenchment. At the same time, we don't know when this phase is going to let up. It could be that we have in place, like I said, better treatments, things that are going to make this phase shorter than the last phase. And we want to be prepared for growth as soon as possible when we get out of this, because that's what makes it most likely that we'll have a V-shaped recovery where we return to the growth path that we were on before. And so some policies that are supportive during this crisis can be inhibitive during the recovery. So the most obvious is the boost that we had to unemployment insurance. So that gave an enormous liquidity boost to low-income people during the acute phase of the crisis. But as the economy starts to recover, it becomes an enormous drag. And so how do you balance what to do about something like the boost in unemployment insurance? All this is complicated by the legislative calendar. And so after Congress passes this bill, they're going to be out until Labor Day. They'll come back for roughly a month in mid-September, and then they'll be out again until after the elections. Partisan politics is going to increase intensely as we make it till September. And then after the election, in the lame duck session, it's difficult to get anything passed. And so I think we have to be thinking about the framework that we put down now to be ready for 6 months, to carry us for at least 6 months until January. And then thinking about how hard that's going to be, remember that the virus really only started to hit hard in the United States 4 months ago. So we're talking about a framework that's got to last us for 150% of the time that we've already been in before we even have a chance to really make major adjustments to it. So what can we do? So there is an acknowledgement that we need another liquidity bridge. Like I said, it could be that the next phase is even worse. What that would suggest is we need a similar sort of liquidity infusion as we had in the first round. And so some people have suggested additional rounds of stimulus checks. Some people have suggested just keeping the UI system that we've had at least through January. Some people have suggested that we suspend the payroll tax. Each of those has some concerns associated with them. First, all of them are really expensive. Each one takes up several $100 billion at least. Congress has become more concerned about the price tag. It's talking about capping it at $1 trillion or a little over $1 trillion. When each one of those programs is 300, 400 billion apiece, you quickly run out of funds. When you think about checks, they're universal, but they probably have the least impact. When you think about re-upping UI, at least re-upping it at its current rate, that's targeted towards the most vulnerable, but again, it creates those strong disincentive effects. And if we put that in place through January and we do see growth later in the year, we're going to cut that growth short, and that could lead to a prolonged recession. And then the payroll tax suspension doesn't have the disincentive effects, but is also targeted towards people with the least liquidity needs. So it's people who already have jobs, and of course, people who make more, get more under a suspension. So there's a couple of other things that have been put in place, some of which our other panelists talked about to think about growth. Some people talked about a new PPP. I don't know if there's a lot of appetite for that among banks, or there's a lot of appetite among that for businesses, but that's been talked about. Possibly just some forgiveness, some broad-based forgiveness for old PPP, a capital gains tax cut, and then incentives to bring jobs back from overseas. All of those have concerns too. So like I said, just about everyone had a bad experience with the PPP program. It was complicated. It was difficult to navigate. Although people have learned something, I think even now, there are going to be a lot of businesses, as Laura talked about, who are completely locked out. And so simply bringing back a modified PPP is probably not going to work. Forgiveness, I think, is an interesting idea, but it undermines some of what little transparency there was in the original PPP. So people were trying to make decisions about, should I take this or should I not take this? Do I qualify? Do I not qualify? And to give a blanket forgiveness to everyone, no matter if they qualified for the original conditions, then makes it even harder for businesses next time to navigate the system, because they have to think about not only what are the rules now, but how are the rules going to change going forward. And then a capital gains cut, so I've talked about a lot, is not really effective in this environment. What we have is in the world total, a lot of investment funds available, but as Justin talked about, they're afraid to move into areas where there's more risk, and that's because there's just this undercurrent of risk in the entire environment. So trying to get more people to save is not exactly what you need. What you need is to get those savings targeted towards investment. And then incentives to bring jobs back are really popular. I think everyone sees the need probably for reshoring. There are companies that want to do that on their own. They're increasing national security reasons to do it. But if we take the approach that I think is most common and say we're going to give credits or targeted assistance to companies that bring jobs back, that creates an uneven playing field across the country. And also it kind of ironically punishes firms that never left the United States and are perhaps in a better position because of it. They lose out relative to a competitor that went overseas and is now trying to come back. So what can we do? So reforming UI, I think, is going to be one of the hardest things to do. One of the most interesting sort of proposals comes out of the Becker-Friedman Institute. What we do there is, instead of giving sort of like a $600 flat addition to unemployment, they would increase the sort of supplemental proportion of unemployment that people get. So most states up to a certain level give a percentage of income that you made over the applicable period. What the Becker-Friedman proposal would do would have the federal government simply add maybe another 20 or 30% on top of that. They have research showing that would cut the number of people who are making above 100% of previous wages down to maybe about 10 or 20%. But it would make sure that almost everyone has nearly as much or as much as they had before. So it more carefully targets that. At the same time, we could give bonuses for going back to work. So one method of doing this might be to give bonuses that are proportional to how many weeks you've been on unemployment. So if you've been on unemployment for 3 or 4 weeks, say you get $100 a week bonus for going back, or $200 a week bonus for going back. That gives people who've been unemployed the longest the most sort of incentive to come back, and it doesn't create sort of a perverse structure you can have with back to work bonuses, where you're actually advantaged for getting laid off for a short period and then coming back over having been employed the whole time. So having some sort of proportional system like that. Then we could do loans to businesses at a very low rate. So Economic Innovation Group has an idea for low interest loans, maybe around 1% for 30 years. to all businesses at a flat rate of about 200% of revenues, or 200% of average revenues through 2018 through 2019. That has a really low cost to the Treasury. It could probably be administered by the Fed. It would be extremely broad-based, and it would give people certainty for years forward, and it'd be much easier to qualify for than all the hurdles you have to jump through for PPP. What happens is you just get the loan based on your average revenues for the last 2 years. On top of that, I think there's some specific things that we can do with a tax policy. So Justin talked about NOLs and how important they are to startups. We think that's important to even larger, more established firms. And so one thing that we've thought about is for firms that are above, say, the $100 million cap or whatever cap we go to, we allow them to cash out any tax attributes at maybe 90 cents on the dollar. So that would include unused credits, R&D credits, whatever credits they have, unused depreciation, unused NOLs. They could cash any of that out with the Treasury for 90 cents on the dollar. And that would provide enormous liquidity to businesses of all sizes. It would also mean that there isn't some sort of like hard limit. So for smaller firms, maybe you can get 100%, up to qualify, but there's no limit. Wherever you set that limit, it's not hard. You can still get 90% above that, no matter how large of a business you are. And so it's, again, tries to make the system as broad-based and as simple as possible. And then in order to think about, well, what can we do now to set the stage for growth? What we've suggested is to permanently improve cost recovery for business. This has been something we've talked about over the COVID period a lot. What we would do is we would make 100% expensing for equipment permanent, 100% expensing for R&D permanent, and then introduce something called neutral cost recovery for structures. All of those programs essentially allow businesses to get more value back for their investment that they make, their investment in equipment, their investment in R&D, their investment in new structures. Currently, many of those expenses have to be depreciated over time. Right now, equipment can be expensed immediately, but that's going to go away in 2022. Right now, some R&D can be expensed immediately, but that's going to go away in 2022. And just like both Laura and Justin mentioned, they're decisions that decisions that businesses have to make right now about how they're going to adjust to this crisis, about how they're going to restructure, that may take years to implement. And so having these cutoffs in 2022 complicates that decision. They don't know whether or not moving to a completely different model is going to be affordable. This makes it more affordable across the board by making that permanent past 2022. Then for structures, which are probably going to be really important in the recovery, as we think about what our physical landscape is going to look like, as we think about what our private infrastructure is going to look like, they have no cost recovery right now. And so instead of giving incentives, special incentives for people who bring, say, factories back, we would give enhanced cost recovery for anyone who's building a new facility. It would be the same, economically, it would be the same kind of cost recovery we're offering for equipment. For reasons that make it a little bit easier for real estate type companies or large investors who would adopt a system called neutral cost recovery, which we have lots on our website about, but it's probably a little bit more we can talk about right now. But essentially it indexes the depreciation for large investments that a company would take over time, retains the value of those, and gives them the same sort of economic treatment as full expensing. And so that's going to set the stage for large companies who need to move back to the United States, and also companies who are here, who are already here and need to change the way they do business. As Laura said, there's some companies which are actually in a position to expand because of this environment. People who do more delivery, people who need to build warehouses. This gives improved cost recovery for that to start as soon as possible. It provides an immediate boost. I think our first two panelists sort of explained that from a business perspective. From the economic perspective, what you would say is that you have businesses look at their cost recovery over an entire horizon for a growth path that they have to go to. And what we're trying to do is get the economy, get investment to shift to that higher growth path. And in order to do that, it needs to have certainty over the entire long run. If there's just a temporary hump, that might shift around when investment happens, but it can't increase the total amount of investment that's going to occur. And that's what we're going to need. And we're going to need it to happen as soon as possible. And so putting in these programs right now gives businesses the incentive to start investing. Some of them are ready to do it now because of the way COVID affects their company. The ones that aren't ready to do it now, it lays the framework so that as soon as we're at the point in the crisis where they are ready, the incentives are there for them to expand. And so using sort of that combination of proposals and adjustment to UI to reduce that incentive or disincentive to work, perhaps a replacement that's low cost in terms of long loans for businesses for PPP, and then focusing on cashing out tax attributes and providing enhanced cost recovery for businesses to get us in a place where we're ready to grow as soon as businesses are able to grow, which is something that we can't say right now. And we need to have in place right now, at least through January, because the calendar is going to be tight. It's going to be difficult for us to develop new programs or even adjust the programs that we have already in place.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for 3 excellent presentations. And maybe we can kick it off. Laura, I want to get your response to some of the ideas that have been presented. You had mentioned how a number of your clients either found the PPP program too complicated, they didn't have good working relationships with banks, some weren't just simply unable to take advantage of it. You stressed the need for simplicity and stability. How do some of these proposals, such as cashing out tax attributes and so forth, strike you as solutions to some of the problems that you identified for your clients?
Well, I do like the NOL, extending the NOL carryback, and then also cashing out the current tax inventory. Actually, I love it, right? Because it simplifies things. You use an existing mechanism. You know, the CPAs have to deal with it. The tax people have to deal with it. As long as we could get the money earlier, I think that would be beneficial. So I love those things. The unfortunate thing about that is it is only providing relief for people who historically have been profitable or who have an inventory, right, of tax things. So I think it's great for that segment of the economy and business. I think that for the small business, they need just a much different solution, because many times they don't have a complex tax strategy. Their NOL, might have been really not significant because they're not making millions of dollars. They're probably what I call a family-owned business, or they're just making enough money to get by. So again, if you believe that you need to have that distribution across the board, which currently, based on the stats, yes, you do need to have the small businesses as well as the large business. Large businesses bring in the quantity as far as the dollars. The small businesses are the small-time employers, the 1 or 2 people. We need to have solutions for both. But I think as far as, okay, maybe I'm naive, but the execution as far as the NOL carryback and the inventory, if we could do that now, that would be an instant impact as far as what we can project out to the bottom line this year, especially if we could get the cash now. So I love it. Keep doing it.
You hear that, Capitol Hill? Justin, let me blend 2 questions here that you may have touched on some of these, but let me just blend them. Chris Smith says, second round of PPP seems like an obvious answer. Small biz already understands it. Funding and program already in place. Flexibility Act made it workable. Why not? And then the follow-up is, well, federal Main Street lending program has been a failure. Can it be modified to make it work without undercutting the banking sector? Any thoughts on either of those questions?
I think those are good questions. I would say that you could certainly have something where there's a combination of PPP, tax assets monetization, and employee retention credit, because each kind of fits different business models. I think one of the problems that folks have from the CARES Act is that they view the world through, I think, too broad of a lens on the business model. Large incumbent businesses, corporations, small Main Street business with banking relationships, and families and individuals. And these other models out there, micro businesses, growth companies, from our world, et cetera, that all have all different types of nuances to it, didn't fit neatly into any of those models. And that's why I tend to think some sort of optionality here is probably the best way to go forward. I would agree that I think PPP should be rebooted. And for those companies that it is effective for, that makes sense. In our world, I would be surprised if 10% of startups ended up accessing PPP because of the various challenges. Main Street is probably 0% because of the profitability test. And I think both of them, as Laura pointed out, which I thought was a very good point, the challenge with both of them is that they run through the banking system, whereas tax assets monetization runs through the tax system, which is a lot more efficient in my view and doesn't have that middleman. And that's why I tend to think that those that have existing relationships within the banking system, those programs can be rebooted and work very efficiently. But for companies that don't have as established a relationship with the banking system, startups being a large chunk of them, but also a number of other models, there should be other programs. And this is why I think layering tax assets monetization and a bolstered employee retention credit could be helpful, because each one of these can find relief in a program that is more well suited to that model.
Thanks, Carl. Let me kind of toss it over to you. How do we ensure that the relief efforts are well targeted and benefiting the people that need it most? And maybe for all of you, how do we provide liquidity for businesses and even individuals without picking winners and losers? Maybe as an offshoot of that, how do you avoid propping up zombie companies? So I got a lot of questions there, and probably 3 questions in one. I'll let you kind of pick and choose how to tackle those.
Right, and so those questions, particularly about how to make sure that everyone who gets it needs it, not picking winners and losers, and not propping up zombie companies, were sort of at the heart of why we looked at the tax proposals that we did and some of the outside proposals that we did about how to handle this. So one of the good things about NOL cash outs is that these are attributes that companies already own. They already belong to them. And so in that sense, the government is not handing money to one person or to another. That doesn't get to everybody who needs it. This is one reason for a really simple, broad-based loan proposal we think could be something like a 1% interest loan for 30 years of 200% of your 2018-2019 revenue. That would go to a broad swath of businesses, but it would be limited to a certain amount. So you can't just continue to get funds forever. You have a specific set of funds that's based on how much revenue you had before the crisis. But businesses that think that they can make it through it, they get this loan. The loan is paid back over a long period of time. Because it is paid back and it's not a grant, the cost of the treasury is low. Because it has straightforward and one requirement, we think that it could be run through the Fed instead of a treasury program, which would make it much easier for banks to do. You just fill out whatever the form is, you show your revenues, and then you get the loan. We think it would be a much easier program to run. It would be able to be run through the Fed, which is larger, more efficient than Small Business Administration. So that's kind of why we chose those things to give the broadest sort of suite of programs, not to lean on one side or the other. On the issue of cost recovery, again, that provides an enormous sort of bang for the buck. Laura talked about how do we find the most bang for the buck. When we look at our analysis, some of our cost recovery programs, if you were to do the whole thing, would provide a GDP growth, a long-term GDP growth of about 5% for the cost of some of these short-term programs for only 6 months, right? So some of these programs, short-term programs, would cost about $300–400 billion over 6 months. A full cost recovery program would cost about $300–400 billion over 10 years, over the entire budget window, but it would provide certainty through this entire period. It would also, unlike credits, not pick winners and losers throughout that period. So answering those questions is precisely why we try to choose these suite of programs. I think dealing with the unemployment insurance question is a lot more complicated. Like I said, I think the Becker Institute's approach is one way to keep there from being a certain liquidity crisis, but removing what now is a disincentive for people to go back to work because they're getting a UI boost that is more than what they were getting or would be getting at a job. So
I may just add to that if you don't mind, because I think it's a great question, and maybe this answer is a little controversial, but I'm comfortable behind it. The fact is, at the end of the day, not propping up zombie companies and making sure that everyone who needs it gets it, or looking at long-term recovery, are actually kind of mutually exclusive, right? And so, as you know, the dirty secret of policymaking is that there's, especially federal policy making, is that you got to kind of pick a priority and go with it, warts and all, if you want it to be effective. And so my view of it is, I worry less about the helping those who don't need it than I do about propping up zombie companies. Because if you help those who don't need it, what's the worst that happens? You have a little bit stronger set of companies coming out the other end. If all you do is dump a bunch of money to zombie companies, you're putting good money after bad, and you may have accomplished a little bit of short-term recovery piece, but your long-term economic prospects are dimmed. And so my view of it is, take the New York Times article about a company that didn't need the money that got it on the chin and say, you know what, if we succeeded getting the money to good companies who needed it and a few good companies that didn't, that's a lot better than money going to zombie companies. But pick a priority and be strong, live with the controversy, because it's going to come no matter what you do. That's sort of my view of it.
And I want to weigh in on that too. And this is probably, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but you know what? This is a big problem, and we're going to break some eggs, right? When you make that omelet. And so we are not going to be able to address every single segment, individual, industry group, whatever. What we are trying to do is enable the structure to move forward so it can grow. And so sometimes I think when you see those headlines, on one hand, it is informative, and what it does mean something, but sometimes you just got to bite the bullet and say, yeah, I'm gonna, there are going to be some people who shouldn't be getting it. We're all going to know people who shouldn't have got it, but if that's the price to pay to move the economy, the United States, a global economy forward, unfortunately, I've never seen a perfect answer. So this is not the time to be to be waiting for that perfect answer, because sometimes I tell people you got to do nothing versus doing something. The greater price is to do nothing. So do something. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be right. Steel yourself for the bad feedback and understand that when you get the stats back, it's going to be more good than bad, right? And that's what I think we have to get out of the absolute terms of making decisions and saying what's better. Is it better than it was before? Yes, keep going. So that's mine.
Well, thank you. The great economist Thomas Sowell once said there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And
yes.
I want to thank all of you for presenting not only the trade-offs, but I think some excellent ideas that can help move the economy forward in the long term, but also help in the short term, and identifying those balances and those trade-offs. And I apologize to those of you at home that send in questions we don't have time for. We'll be transitioning in just a minute to the second panel, but thanks to Laura for your insights and on-the-ground experience with your clients, Justin, for bringing us your perspective from the investor side. And Carl, thank you again for providing a broader outline of the path forward in some really innovative ways. And I think we've tackled a lot in this panel, and hopefully Capitol Hill will be listening. The negotiators will be listening to some of the ideas that we presented here. So thank you, all three of you, and look forward to future discussions. This was really a very, very interesting panel. We'll be transitioning now to our second panel, the second part of our doubleheader. So thanks to all three of you. That was terrific and very, very insightful comments and presentations. For those of you who may be tuning in for the second part of the panel, we will show you again how you can present or send us comments and questions. Again, the webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to watch this again or send it to your friends and family. Do include your name and organization when you're sending in questions, and you can send them through the little directions there at the bottom. So hopefully we can get to those. There are already a lot of questions that were sent in from those of you who signed up for the program. So there's some really interesting questions that we'll be tackling here today. We'll get the second part of the program today is addressing state budget shortfalls. Now, thanks to a record level of spending and falling tax revenues at the federal level, the Congressional Budget Office reports that the federal deficit topped $860 billion in June. And that brings the total deficit for the first 9 months of the federal fiscal year 2020 to $2.7 trillion. Well, the COVID-induced economic slowdown is also forcing states to increase spending while tax revenues are collapsing for them. But states have balanced budget requirements and don't have the luxury of running large deficits and borrowing in the same way that Washington can. By our estimates, state tax revenues for fiscal year 2020 and 2021 will fall some $191 billion short of initial tax revenue projections for those 2 years. The question for our second panel today is, how should Washington and the states respond to these shortfalls? Now, Congress has already provided considerable aid to the states, albeit for specific needs such as education and healthcare. So the question is, should the Phase 4 package send federal dollars to replace those missing state revenues? But what responsibility do states have to solve their own budget problems? And would federal dollars absolve them of the need to fix systemic problems such as underfunded pension programs, just for instance? Well, we've got an excellent panel to address these and other questions facing lawmakers in the weeks and months ahead. Starting us off will be Catherine White, Director of Budget Process Studies at the National Association of State Budget Officers, NASBO. Next up will be our friend Morgan Scarborough, who is an economist and manager of tax policy with the firm Multi-State Associates. And batting cleanup is Jared Walzak, our own Vice President for State Tax Projects at the Tax Foundation. Well, Catherine, the virtual floor is yours. Please kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me here today virtually. So in my remarks to kick off this panel, I'm going to start by talking about the current fiscal environment and revenue shortfalls facing states right now, and then talk about how states are adjusting their budgets to address these shortfalls. And then we'll close with a few comments about what this all means for the need for additional federal aid to states. So what is the current fiscal environment facing states? The COVID-19 pandemic has really transformed state fiscal conditions and budget outlooks, and done so in record time. When governors released their budget proposals for fiscal year 2021, this past winter, unemployment was at a 50-year low. State revenues were coming in ahead of forecasts for most states in fiscal year 2020. And state budget reserves or rainy day funds were at an all-time high. Just a few months later, the nation was facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Unemployment in April reached nearly 15% and is now at around 11% based on June's numbers, which is still higher than it was at its peak during the Great Recession. Travel and tourism ground to a halt. retail sales plummeted, and GDP is believed to have had its worst quarterly decline in the post-World War II era. What does all this mean for state revenues? So states rely on personal income taxes and sales taxes combined for roughly 75% of their general fund revenue in the aggregate. This does vary by state quite a bit, though. And these revenue sources have been hit hard by the stay-at-home orders that were in place this spring, business closures that we're continuing to see, rising unemployment claims. You're also at the same time seeing energy producing states getting hit by collapsing oil prices, tourism heavy states being especially hard hit as well. And really all states are seeing revenue impacts, but in varying ways and varying magnitudes, depending on their tax structures, how hard hit they were by COVID, and other factors. States have been releasing updated revenue forecasts that project the impacts of COVID over the next 1 to 2 years. And a number of states have already announced multi-billion-dollar shortfalls and revenue declines. Some states, though, have yet to release updated projections. So we don't yet have 50 state data on this. Overall, based on the forecasts released to date, as well as what we've seen as fiscal year 2020 has come to a close for most states, is that revenue losses resulting from COVID are expected to exceed the declines that states experienced during the Great Recession. And just for context, from fiscal year 2008 to 2010, according to NASBO data, states saw an 11.6% decline in general fund revenue over those 2 years. But it's also important to note that this is not expected to be just a 1 or a 2 year problem. States are expecting to see impacts of this on their revenues for several years to come based on economic forecasts. Of course, these projections continue to be a moving target with a lot of uncertainty. States are needing to take into account huge and uncertain variables related to this virus, such as when a vaccine or treatment may become available, how this in turn will affect the economic recovery. And for a number of reasons, it's really important to note that the worst is still likely to come for state tax revenues. Right now, as was discussed a lot on the first panel today, there are federal stimulus measures that have been in place, the checks that were sent to individuals this spring, and enhanced unemployment benefits, the PPP, et cetera. And these measures have been propping up parts of the economy and therefore helping state tax revenues. But those are going to run out. And that's what why we're here today to talk about the next phase. Another important point to recognize is that, as I mentioned, states were in relatively strong fiscal shape coming into this crisis. So most states were seeing revenues coming in ahead of projections for fiscal year 2020 before the pandemic hit. So that provided some immediate cushion for some states. And is also somewhat cloaking the impacts that COVID has had on state revenues for fiscal year 2020. And then further complicating the forecasting process and adding to the uncertainty, most states followed the federal government in shifting their state tax deadline from April 15th to July 15th, which caused a sharp drop in personal income tax payments in April. July 15th, of course, was last week. So we'll begin seeing more preliminary reporting by states of how this will close out, how they'll close out fiscal year 2020, as a number of states will be recognizing these delayed payments as fiscal year 2020 revenues. And then related also to these tax returns, another source of uncertainty and also a reason that revenue impacts in the states are expected to worsen is that 2020 tax returns will reflect 2019 economic activity. And so fiscal year 2020 won't be as bad for states, while fiscal year 2021 will likely be much worse, since 2021 tax returns will reflect 2020 economic activity. And then finally, another source of budget uncertainty for states, of course, is the question as to whether additional federal aid will be coming to states. And that's, of course, one of the things we're here to talk about today. So before I talk a little bit more about how states are adjusting their budgets in response to these shortfalls, a couple other things to note about the challenges facing states that are somewhat unique to this crisis. States are really seeing a ripple effect in all areas of their revenue sources. So you're seeing reduced transportation revenues, the closing of courts and the effect that that had on fee revenues, really revenue sources that are usually less vulnerable to the economic cycle. So it's that's just another factor to consider, since we typically focus on general fund revenue only in these discussions. And then, of course, there's, as was mentioned, the additional expenses of addressing the pandemic that are facing states. And these costs are expected to persist after the December 30th deadline to spend the coronavirus relief funds that were provided by the CARES Act to states and localities. So moving on to the question of what steps are states taking to adjust their budgets and address these shortfalls, or what are they considering doing? So as was mentioned, unlike the federal government, states are required by law to balance their budgets, and all states expect revenue loss and a need to adjust their spending plans in response to that. When faced with a budget shortfall, states turn typically to some combination of spending reductions, tax increases, one-time measures such as tapping their rainy day funds, and federal aid to the extent that it's available. Overall, the timing and nature, though, of these budget actions will vary depending on differences in state reserve levels, revenue forecasting processes, tax structures, whether the governor has the authority to reduce the budget, or if the legislature is required to take action, and then other variations in budget processes. As far as what states have done so far, many states took initial steps to rein in spending through executive authority, things like implementing hiring freezes, restricting contracts, sort of the low-hanging fruit of budget cuts. And then in some states, governors also used their authority to reduce the budget through across-the-board or targeted cuts in response to revenue shortfalls for fiscal year 2020. Given the severity of projected revenue losses, some states have already instituted employee furloughs, and in a few cases, even some layoffs, while others have considered or proposed these actions for fiscal year 2021. States have also turned to those other budget management tools I mentioned, the more one-time measures and tapping their rainy day funds to close budget gaps for fiscal year 20 as well as fiscal year 2021. But you're also seeing states reluctant to drain their reserves too quickly, not knowing how long this crisis will persist and impact their revenues. So as far as how states approached their enacting budgets for fiscal year 2021, most states do now have a full year budget in place. Though some have passed temporary budgets as they wait for more certainty, both in terms of federal aid as well as what their revenue outlooks are going to be. And then also some states do have a different fiscal year. So the vast majority did begin fiscal year 21 on July 1st. Some states that had already enacted spending plans before COVID hit, especially some of those biennial states, have already made cuts to those previously enacted plans. And then other states that enacted budgets in the last couple of months adopted plans that were considerably lower than what was proposed by governors, and in some cases lower than the prior year spending level. These budgets took steps such as canceling pay increases, eliminating program expansions and other new spending initiatives, as well as making cuts to base spending and personnel. We saw a few isolated cases of some revenue increases, but these were pretty targeted and mostly related to decoupling from provisions in the CARES Act. Some states are also planning to know that they will need to make mid-year budget adjustments in special sessions in the coming months. And this is why more certainty about federal aid is needed as soon as possible. We've seen governors and their administrations directing agencies to develop budget reduction plans for this fiscal year 2021 by as much as 15% or 20%. And states are going to need to begin budget development for fiscal year 2022 before too long as well. So what does all this mean for the need for federal aid to states? So additional federal aid is not expected to eliminate the need for spending reductions at the state level, but it will be necessary to avoid these more drastic and painful cuts that states are otherwise planning for. Cuts at the levels being considered right now of 15% or more would do real damage, and also make cuts that will lead to large job losses. State and local governments have already shed 1.5 million jobs, mostly in education. And more states will also likely have to turn to tax increases without additional federal aid as well, which would further work against economic recovery. And then another thing just to keep in mind is the more cuts that states have to make from a lower base, the worse and more harmful those cuts have to be. So that's why 2021 budget adjustments are expected to be harder than what states had to do for fiscal year 20. And that's why 2022 budget decisions could be harder even still without additional federal aid. And states also won't have the same access to one-time measures to balance once those are used up. As we saw during the Great Recession, the effects of cuts, particularly on core services for education and healthcare, were mitigated by federal aid to replace lost revenues under the Recovery Act. And the revenue declines, as I mentioned previously, that are expected to result from COVID are expected to exceed the drop in revenues that states experienced during the Great Recession. So with that, I will turn it back over to Scott, and thank you again for having me here today.
Well, thank you, Catherine. No, that was an excellent overview of the issue and the challenges facing all the states. And Morgan, what are you seeing from your perch there at Multi-State Associates?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, for all that good news you were able to bring us today. Like Scott said, my name is Morgan Scarborough. I'm a tax policy manager at Multi-State Associates. I actually was with the Tax Foundation for a couple of years, so I'm really excited to be back here today, hanging out with my friends. So I want
virtually at the Tax Foundation.
I want to preface this by saying I know that it's easy for me to get on this call and speak with maybe legislators or policymakers about what budget situations look like, what states should consider doing. But I understand, and I think most people understand, that states are really in a tough spot as far as the need to provide services for folks, especially as we're seeing a record number of people who are unemployed or folks who are facing healthcare challenges. How do you provide those services and raise revenue for those services while at the same time you've got this tension of trying to facilitate an economic recovery? So like I said, I just want to acknowledge that I understand that difficulty, and I think everyone in this conversation understands that. So with that, I want to look at, I think it can be really instructive to look at what states have previously done in the wake of recessions. So we did some research at Multi-State with my colleague Ryan Manis. This report is up on our website, multistate.us, if you'd like to read some more. but I'm going to go through, and what we basically did was we looked at the 5 most populous states. So California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania. And we looked at those states following the 2001 recession, the dot-com bubble, and the 2007 through 2009 Great Recession to see what actions states took following that in regards to tax policy. So one of the first things that I think is really interesting is that states actually were fairly patient as they responded to these things. So in the first year following after a recession was declared, there were very few new taxes enacted by states. So essentially states were sort of sending the message that they need some time to act to get a better understanding of what revenue outlooks might look like before they start taking action on tax policy. And I think that's going to be even truer for this recession, because I think in this case, there are even more uncertainties because we're coupled with the public health crisis, that states don't really have a lot of great information right now about exactly what kind of new revenue they might actually need. So looking at those 5 states, like I said, California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania, the Great Recession was declared in 2007. In 2008, they raised taxes by a combined $574 million. But in 2009, that number jumped up to $4 billion. So states generally in the past were taking roughly about a year or so to start looking at actually enacting new tax policy. And the spike was relatively limited. So states were really only enacting new tax or increasing revenues for like a year or two following the recession. After the 3rd year that a recession was declared, that new tax activity tended to sort of drop off in states. So what does that mean for right now in this recession that we're facing now? I think that at multi-state, our general thought is that we're not going to see a lot of tax action in states before the November elections. The reasons for that are a couple. So first, like I said, and like Catherine was saying, there's still so much revenue uncertainty within states right now. It's difficult for them to even understand what sort of measures they might need to be taking. And secondly, from a political perspective, you'd be hard pressed to find a legislator who is willing to enact new tax increases to the tune of billions of dollars directly before an election. So I think we'll see some of this action in states maybe starting in maybe late 2020, states coming into special session, or I think a lot of states are going to push and wait until their regular session in 2021 to start looking at tax measures. The second thing we learned from looking at previous recessions is that state responses are generally fairly proportionate to the crisis that they're facing. So in the dot-com bubble, that shaved off about 0.6% of national GDP. And in the 5 states I was talking about following that recession, raised an average of $433 million in new taxes. The Great Recession, however, shaved off about 4.1% of national GDP, and those states then raised an average of about $1.6 billion in new taxes. So generally, they've responded to the magnitude of the crisis that we're facing. I think the alarming part to that is that we're facing a crisis right now that, from an economic perspective, is going to be greater than those 2 things. So we might be seeing a response. I think we likely will be seeing a response that is greater than those 2. But like I said, those 2 numbers that I just gave you were just averages. So as there always is in state data, there are large state-to-state differences here. So in the Great Recession, following that, just California and New York combined raised new revenue of $21 billion. Texas, Florida, and Pennsylvania combined raised $2.6 billion in new revenue. There are a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, there's a function of California and New York are very large states that provide a lot of services in their budget. But there's also obviously the political aspect. What I was really surprised by when we did this, though, is that the political aspect is one factor in how you can look at what states or how states respond to recessions and how you can predict who will respond how to this recession, but it doesn't tell you the full story. So both California and New York during those time periods had split control of government. During that time, they didn't have full partisan control by Democrats. So they had in New York a Republican state Senate. They had some Republican governors throughout those time periods. So like I said, you can use political partisan control to sort of inform maybe what states you're monitoring or how you expect states to respond. But just remember, it doesn't tell the full story. You can't look at this data and say, okay, Republican state, they're not going to raise very much in taxes. Okay, Democratic state, they're going to raise a huge amount in taxes. So like I said, just put that sort of in the context of all of the other variables that you're monitoring to understand that full picture. And lastly, probably most important that we learned is, so we learned states took some time to respond. We learned that states' responses were generally proportionate to the crisis. But what did states actually do? How did they raise revenue? We found actually that it was sort of a scattershot approach to tax policy. Very few times did states actually never did they do a big tax overhaul of their system. It was generally just a little bit here and a little bit there, and maybe what was politically the easiest thing to do. So I thought in particular that when we looked at this data, we would see a lot of states reforming their tax credit system, eliminating exemptions, doing things like that. We didn't see that very often at all. And we didn't see major rate increases to major taxes very often at all either. In fact, out of all of that time period, those 5 states only increased the rate on one of their major tax types 4 times. So California raised its sales tax rate in 2009, New York raised its sales tax rate and their income tax on upper income individuals in 2003, and Pennsylvania increased its individual income tax rate in 2003 as well. So like I said, I wouldn't consider rate changes tax reform in general, but even if you're looking at it from that perspective, that's the only instance that you had of a major tax change. What we did see tax increases on the rate is to what we would call sin taxes. So taxes on things like cigarettes or alcohol or gambling. Those are areas where we did see some rate increases. In fact, we saw that over 20 times. So compare that over 20 times to the couple of times that they raised taxes on major tax rates. And I'm not saying which one is the right answer, but I'm saying it's notable that legislators are far more comfortable raising tax rates on sin taxes or, sort of here and there tax policy changes than sort of these big sweeping things that would affect most folks who are paying taxes. It's also notable that when they enacted sort of benefits for the business community, like maybe extending the net operating loss deduction or something like that, they were fairly large benefits that encompassed or benefited most industries. However, when they levied new taxes, they were often very targeted on specific industries. So following the recessions and in these states, when they levied new taxes, they were generally on healthcare and telecom industries. Now, going forward, I don't think that we're going to see increased taxes on the healthcare industry following this crisis for obvious reasons. I think the telecom industry has seen a lot of tax increases over the last couple of years and might be safe as well. But I think one industry in particular that legislators might target is the tech industry. And the reason for that is we've seen some increased activity on the state level and obviously the federal and global level, which I know Tax Foundation has covered extensively, as far as how states are taxing tech companies, basically. So the most notable experience, I think, was this year in Maryland when they tried to do a digital advertising tax. What's really interesting is that the way that idea sort of took over and took hold was there was an op-ed in the New York Times about how, and this was the declared purpose, this isn't me intuiting anything, that we need to have punitive taxes on tech companies because of the role that they play in society. So actually in Maryland, they said, if we took all of the revenue that we raised from this tax and burned it, it would still be a good tax because the point is to punish tech companies because they're playing, a role in society that they're sort of unregulated and allow a bunch of things that folks don't like. So we need to punish them. So I think that's an industry that we really should watch. I think there's going to be a lot of activity on the state tax level there. And also one tip I would say is just sort of monitor how folks are talking about state tax policy in the news. Like I said, that idea was born, not all the way, but definitely boosted by just one op-ed in the New York Times. So I think it's really important to monitor how folks are talking about these things. I've seen a couple of pieces recently on states enacting excess profits taxes. I personally I would advise against that if you're looking for economic recovery in your state. But basically folks saying, if your revenue increased this year from March to June, if that revenue is higher than it was last year, we're going to tax those excess profits. And I've seen that a couple of times. So I think that is an area that folks should certainly keep an eye on as well. And then lastly, I have sort of a couple of general recommendations for states as they start to approach this economic challenge that they're facing. First, like I said, be patient, don't be hasty. We don't yet have all of the information. I personally am really interested to see what's happening to the economy of states that opened up pretty quickly and then had to backtrack and had to close some things back down because of a surge in cases. What does their tax revenue picture going to look like? Are folks going to continue spending, or have they has consumer confidence fallen in those states again? And then you don't want to enact a bunch of new sweeping tax changes or increases that you later have to go back and change or repeal because you made these changes when you didn't have good revenue information quite yet. Secondly, collaboration. It's always very important, but I think it's crucial right now for all state agencies to be working together to provide the best data possible. A good example of this and the importance of it is that California right now is facing a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit or shortfall that it's hard to imagine how you would even budget around something like that. But actually the LAO there, the Legislative Analyst's Office, released data showing that wage withholding is down only 1.7% compared to last year. So what can different data from different agencies tell us about how the economy is responding and more importantly, where states should target their financial assistance? So I think interagency communication is really crucial right now. Third, avoid enacting policies that's going to hinder economic recovery. I think it's really important to remember right now that a lot of businesses are hurting not because of their own actions or a financial choice that they made, but because they were mandated to shut down. And while I think that was absolutely the correct decision as we're facing this public health crisis, it's really important to remember that as well as we start thinking about how states can target financial relief that these businesses are suffering in large part because they had no choice but to close their doors for some period of time. A lot of this is going to depend obviously on the federal response, which seems to change day to day. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to let Jared be the one who gets to predict that.
Well, thank you, Morgan, and good to have you back virtually. And Jared, I'll let you clean up here and bring it all together.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Catherine and Morgan. Morgan, good to have you back with us for a day at least, or for an hour. There are a lot of difficult decisions the states will need to make, and there is a lot that the federal government needs to decide in the coming days and weeks. To build a little on what Morgan was talking about, there are a couple of different things that are obviously going to be weighing on lawmakers' minds in state capitals. And I do think there is a sense in some areas that with limited economic activity in some regards that you tax anything that moves. And that's going to be a challenge because you don't necessarily want to stop those engines of economic activity, but you do see some states that are saying things like, well, the tech industry looks like it's weathering this storm reasonably well compared to other industries, which is true on the margin, though I think if you talk to those industries, you have a handful of companies doing very well, you have many not doing nearly as well. But it looks like a source of revenue, it's an area of activity, so you are seeing these taxes. What may have begun as a punitive tax in one state or may have been borrowed from the European experience where you have a very different tax base and the justification was different, just becomes, hey, here's this bundle of taxes that we could impose on an industry that looks like it could afford it. And that's potentially a concern. We, again, don't want to have punitive taxes. We don't want to have taxes that are targeted at one particular industry. Those tend to be very inefficient. They are inequitable almost by definition. And they tax a lot of companies that you don't necessarily think of when you are designing these taxes. The digital advertising tax, like in Maryland, for instance, most of the burden is actually going to be on Maryland advertisers. So it is that restaurant or small business that's reopening, trying to reopen, and wants to advertise that it has reopened. It is ultimately bearing most, not all, but most of the cost of those taxes. Most states probably are going to try to limit just how much they impose new taxes or increase taxes right now. And this makes sense. We are in the middle of a crisis. You generally don't want to raise taxes substantially while businesses are trying to reopen, while you need reinvestment. Most states get that. That's one of the reasons, to what Morgan said, why states took a while during the Great Recession and previous cycles. One is to gauge what the losses are, but two, you don't want to rush into this. You may need additional revenue, but you want to make sure that you're not competing with the ability to get your economy back up and running. And that's especially true now. Federal aid can come into that discussion because it gives states a little more buffer. States have some already. They had rainy day funds. They do need to make cuts. Some states have done so, some have done less. They need to make these revisions, but yeah, that breathing room for businesses and for individuals can be very valuable. I want to take a step back and talk about what state aid has looked like to date and what that could look like, because that's obviously a very important discussion at the federal level. We're seeing a lot about this right now with that fourth package of relief being in active deliberations right now. Some of the deliberations around the CARES Act, with the previous large package, they weren't about flexible state fiscal relief. So there was this idea, certainly, that states needed money to cover COVID-19 testing. They needed it for the direct health response. They needed it for some of the other responses, the economic responses, but it wasn't primarily intended to backfill state budgets. So the budget hole, simply because economic activity has slowed, that really wasn't addressed that much by the CARES Act. But there's a bit of a misapprehension that it did nothing in that regard. And I want to put that to rest a little, because it is important to have a baseline for the discussion of what comes next. In the CARES Act, and to a lesser degree in the prior bill, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, you had, in our estimate, about $535 billion in federal aid that's been appropriated to states and localities. Most of it is restricted in some way. The $150 billion Coronavirus Relief Fund is largely that immediate disaster response. The $50 billion that was freed up by the Stafford Act with the disaster relief, that kind of goes to what the name would imply. You had funding for COVID-19 testing. You had a variety of things like this, pretty targeted, dedicated funding. You also had $274 billion in emergency supplemental funding, basically increasing funding for existing programs, grants, and other programmatic funding. Some of this is fairly fungible. For instance, there's about $31 billion for education, about $25 billion for transit, a few other packages. There was also a roughly $50 billion increase due to a higher FMAP. This is the higher Medicaid reimbursement rate. What's notable about all of these is the states don't have to account for that per se in increased spending in those areas. That money has to go to education or transit or Medicaid, but they can withdraw some of the funding that they were already going to put from state sources into that and instead repurpose it to something else. So you get about at least $106 billion in aid that can be considered flexible. And in fact, that's largely how flexible aid was provided during the Great Recession. There was about $143.6 billion in flexible aid during the Great Recession. Most of it was through mechanisms like that. It wasn't just a package that basically said flexible aid for states. It was things like raising FMAP or providing this emergency supplemental funding. So we're about 70% of the way there to what was provided in the Great Recession in flexible aid. There's also a much larger pool of more dedicated aid that is much larger than we saw in the Great Recession. But as Catherine noted, this is going to be a larger crisis for states than the Great Recession. And at least on that flexible side, we are not yet at those levels where states will potentially need more. So there's the question, of course, what do states need? What are their losses? And what do we expect of them? And it's difficult to get a handle on state revenue losses. States' experiences differ. Some states have significant losses. Some will be more attenuated because of the state of their economy, how hard they were hit by the actual virus, the decisions they made about lockdowns. Their estimates will also differ because each state approaches revenue projections in a different way. And it's a little hard to try to bring them together in a meaningful way and say this is, comparable across them. But we are starting to get a sense of a couple of things. One, what types of taxes are being hit, and how far each of those are falling, and also maybe roughly what the revenue forecast will be for the next year or so. All the major taxes are, of course, being hit. We saw sales taxes fall the fastest first, which makes sense. We had essentially lockdowns. Most states had significant stay-at-home orders. People were very wary of going out even for essential shopping initially. What shopping they did do was probably buying groceries and maybe a few other personal supplies that are largely untaxed. So the sales tax revenues just dropped off precipitously. But they've actually grown back to pretty close to normal now. So you lose a couple of months, but you're not having that continued activity. It will be down lower, but not as low as some other taxes. So looking at the current fiscal year, we've taken the 12 states that have issued the most recent large-scale revenue forecast, basically ones that put more than just a top-line figure, that actually broke it down by taxes, that provided a couple of years of revenue analysis. We've taken those that represent 25% of the total tax collections across the country, and we've extrapolated. And what we see is the current fiscal year, the one that began for most states July 1st, the individual income tax collection should be down about 9% from where they were in fiscal 19, the last full pre-crisis year. Sales tax will be down 7%, and it'll be rising pretty rapidly after this fiscal year. The corporate income tax, thankfully for states, a relatively small share of revenue, but it's down 28% in these estimates because, of course, many businesses just don't have any profits right now, no net income to be taxed. If you extrapolate that out, what you see is a revenue loss nationwide for those two fiscal years. Fiscal year 2020, the one that just ended, and fiscal 2021, the one that we have just entered, that is about $121 billion below state tax collections in fiscal 2019. Of course, states thought they were going to see increased collections these years. We're estimating that it is 191 billion, almost 200 billion below the initial projections for those 2 years. And this is actually very consistent with what some of the other recent projections are. There was a study by some economists at MIT and ODU that produced an estimate that compared to projection, this year's loss would be 112 billion. We're projecting 118 billion, very close. Tax Policy Center projected 125 billion for this year. Again, all coming in this rough range, 100, maybe 100 to 125 billion dollars in revenue losses this year compared to projections. That is significant. It's a lot. It is, however, not nearly as much as was initially thought by many. If you look at some of the initial discussions where states needed perhaps 500 billion, there are discussions of even more than that from the federal government. So not just that they would lose 500 billion, but they would need 500 billion. Those numbers aren't coming in quite the same way. Now, it's important to acknowledge that a package like that isn't about one fiscal year. As Catherine said, you have multiple years of losses. It takes a while to grow back. But still, this gives you a sense of what that need is, and it's really significant, perhaps, but perhaps, however, a little lower. It's something where we can start to get a sense of what you need. States also are, of course, generally expected to save for a rainy day, to make their own contributions to closing a shortfall during an economic downturn. We don't want to eliminate the incentives for states to prepare for the next downturn or to cover up all of the different decisions they make by providing more than they actually need to cover the losses, which again, there have been proposals that would effectively do that. On the other hand, this crisis is genuinely unique. No state was really prepared for a crisis of this magnitude. No one anticipated that we would have basically an economic lockdown for several months with continued slow staging and phasing back in. So there may be a role for the federal government to do more to help states so that they don't have to make precipitous tax increases or the most difficult revenue cuts, spending cuts rather, and that they can phase in these changes more gradually and in a more economically viable way. But again, you don't want to match dollar for dollar what those losses are. You expect states to come to the table and try to address this in a number of ways themselves. Once you've decided that there is maybe a role for the federal government, there are a number of questions. Really, I think that broadly speaking, it comes down to what the allocation method is, what the timing is, what the amount is, and how much flexibility there is. Flexibility, I think there's been broad agreement at this point that any additional package should be fairly flexible, allowing federal funding to flow to states' most urgent needs. This is good. It means that you're less likely to create long-term dependency because particular programs are funded certain ways. You don't waste money by funding something the states don't need funded. You allow them to address the most urgent needs. And as long as you have the amount set reasonably, there's not a lot of moral hazard like, oh, you're going to bail out your pension fund, because you're probably not providing enough to bail that out. You're going to have other needs you're spending it for. So then you come into the rest, the amount, the allocation, all of that. Let's talk briefly about allocation, because there are a lot of potential perverse incentives or just some problems with that. Broadly speaking, we can think of three baskets. You could do this population-based. That's basically how the Coronavirus Relief Fund within the CARES Act was done. You could do an economic or fiscal approach where it's tied more directly to specific needs. You can also use coronavirus cases and use that as a proxy. You do population-based, it doesn't reward or punish the decisions of states. It's fairly neutral. It just looks at how many people you have. This is what you're going to need to help cover these gaps. If you do economic or fiscal, it's tied to those specific needs. There is a lag in relevant economic data. There's some consistency issues. And if you're doing it fiscal based, like on the size of a revenue loss or some of those shortfalls, then it can discriminate based on the size of government. It can reward poor planning, dissuade states from necessary reforms. But if you use a more economic measure, like the change in actual unemployment, then you have less of that. And there's a lag, but it's not enormous. And then you have coronavirus cases. I would personally argue that that's a weak proxy at this point. Not only do you have snapshot data issues, there's reporting issues. It potentially has some effects in how we regulate these health numbers, which is probably not good. We don't want to insert a funding component to how you report cases. And it neglects the cost for states that kept case counts low, but at a significant economic cost. It's really just not the right measure for this. So maybe population-based combined with perhaps an employment measure would be a good way to do this. And then timing comes into this. You can stagger the relief payments. You could have them, if you say X amount is what we're giving, you could say, but we're doing it over 2 or 3 payments over a course of months or the next year or year and a half, so that we can reevaluate. We can 6 months from now look at another snapshot of what economic conditions are. This also means by not providing a lump sum up front that states have to start making those tough decisions. They can't postpone them for another 6 months because they have all of this money up front. This doesn't necessarily mean automatic stabilizers. They don't have to be open-ended. Congress can put an amount on this, but it does make sense, I think, to stagger them to some degree. There's been discussion right now about a couple of different ways to do this. And one, of course, is to free up the money within the Coronavirus Relief Fund. There is $150 billion there. Some states took their allocation. They spent it very quickly because they had a lot of urgent need. A state like New York had a lot of the health needs. They had some of the economic needs. I don't know exactly where they are in their spending of that, but you could see them running through that. Other states said, well, without flexibility, what do we do with this money? And they are looking at some really inefficient uses right now. So there are some proposals to, at very least, start by making the rest of that fund flexible. Treasury's done about everything it can to flex that. They've said that you can put it towards making unemployment compensation payments, that you can use it to pay payroll expenses for healthcare workers, public safety workers, and other state employees to the extent that they are reprogrammed to be responding for now to the COVID-19 crisis. But to the extent that states are still sitting on money with no high use, reprogramming some of that can be helpful. But bear in mind, there's going to be differences. Some states had to spend all of that already or spent most of it. So there's been that discussion, what comes next. I think there is a role for something to come next, but maybe something smaller than had been discussed early on, where we talk about $1.1 trillion packages between state and local governments, or even the $500 billion package. Something that is staggered, so the states need to start making these decisions now and not just rely on that federal aid. Something that is responding to the actual economic conditions in the state and trying not to incentivize or disincentivize certain decisions, policy decisions that states make. I think about, there have been some proposals that say, well, let's use the projected revenue losses that states have. But every state projects revenue losses different ways. Sometimes states have several scenarios. California, for instance, has 2 different projections. One is for a U-shaped recovery, one's for an L-shaped recovery. Every state could do that. And of course, if you are going to say that how much revenue you get is based on the projected loss, you have a very strong incentive to choose the more aggressive losses. Now, I think budget officers are doing their absolute best. Revenue officials are struggling to estimate this. It's a unique circumstance, but you have to make a lot of decisions, all of them individually, probably perfectly justifiable. But if that decision is being driven not just by how close can we get so that we can make the right choices, but also it influences how much federal money we get, that's going to put a thumb on the scale on choices and disadvantage states that are less likely to do so. It's just not how you want to do revenue projections. So I don't think that's an ideal way. Again, using a more neutral, objectively measured instrument like employment loss would make significantly more sense. And finally, I'd say states need to be acting now, regardless of what the federal government chooses to do. Some states have already acted, as Catherine and to some extent Morgan were talking about, where they've already made some adjustments in spending. Many states, however, have really delayed doing too much because they want to see what's coming. The longer a state delays, the more difficult it will be to make those cuts. If you can say you trim a little off of 12 months worth of activity, that is far better than spending at normal rates for 6 or 8 months and then cutting deeply for the last few. You want to try to avoid that. There's also spending that you could simply delay entirely this year or cut that, nothing's painless, but some things are less painful than others. And once it's out the door, you might have a relatively low priority thing you've already spent on, but that money is gone. Now you have to cut something higher priority. So states shouldn't be waiting. Everyone knows that states are going to be asked to come to the table in ways that they haven't yet. That was the experience of the Great Recession. It was the experience of every recession we've had before. Even if there is additional federal aid, that's not a good excuse or a reason for states to be delaying some of these hard choices. They only get harder the longer you wait. On taxes, if you can delay, that's good, because again, you don't want to harm the economic recovery. But on spending, there has to be some sort of attenuation sooner rather than later, because it gets harder the later you wait. As has been noted, most states have not done a lot on the tax front yet. California is the only state that has had what I would consider a meaningful tax increase, where within their corporate income tax, they suspended net operating loss provisions for 3 years, and they capped credits at $5 million per company, regardless of the size of that company or how many credits they were carrying. Those are both 3-year temporary policies, but they're very significant. They raise hundreds of, I don't remember exactly. It's a significant amount within the corporate income tax and their franchise tax. Other states have postponed a few things. Arizona was actually scheduled to phase in a tax cut on retirement income. That's not going to happen right now. A couple of states have decided to decouple from provisions of the CARES Act that are intended to enhance investment. It's not always great policy. Some of these are ways that states could help the economic recovery, but this is an area where conforming to federal policy would have resulted in a reduction of revenues, and they canceled the reduction, which I think we can conceptually distinguish between actually raising a tax from its previous baseline. And again, we've not seen any rate increases to date. We're likely to see that soon, probably on excise taxes, as Morgan indicated. But the degree to which states can be conscientious about this, and then make sure that they are not penalizing the things we need most, which is rehirings as the health crisis abates and allows us to do that, and reinvestment where there's been a loss of capital accumulation. These are things that we want to prioritize. And I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Scott for any questions that people have.
Great. Thank you, all three of you, for some very, very interesting comments and overview. And we've got a ton of questions that come in and not a lot of time. So it'll have to almost be rapid fire answers. But I do want to get to as many as I can. I'm going to start out with a question for Catherine that is really kind of interesting. I didn't expect this. How do state debt loads factor into all of this? And would you envision any states missing a debt payment on their general obligation bonds because of the shortfall? Seen anything like that?
So we haven't heard discussion of that, and we would expect states to, of course, prioritize making debt payments while managing their budgets. So I would say at this juncture, that's not something that I would that we would see states doing as a first resort, responding to these shortfalls.
Even in Illinois, that can't pay their bills most of the time. Morgan, let me get you. You brought up the digital issue, and I know this is going to be a big issue for everyone here. Any thoughts about states expanding or creating taxes on remote sellers, especially with the substantial increase of online purchases, also taxes on goods and services? Very, very interesting. What are you seeing there? What do you anticipate? And what might that look like?
As far as digital advertising taxes go, I do think that's going to be on the table for states. I know I was talking about states not doing huge tax overhauls or big changes, but they did do a lot of targeted increases on certain industries. So I certainly think digital advertising taxes will be on the table, even when you're looking at it in the context of previous responses to recessions. And as far as taxes on remote sellers go, I don't anticipate that we'll see a ton of changes there, simply because most states now, the vast majority, have adopted sales taxes on remote sellers in the wake of Wayfair. I think there's only maybe one or two holdouts that levy a state sales tax that remain that haven't done so. So I don't think we'll see a ton of changes in that area.
Jared, you were on CNBC recently talking about New York and some of the taxes that were being considered on wealthy people. Lo and behold, I saw another segment this morning on CNBC about the potential for in New York for changing to mark-to-market taxation of capital gains on the wealthy in particular. What might you see in terms of moves to tax the rich? Much like, as Morgan said, the digital companies are the target because they've been most successful during this. The same attitude seems to be, let's tax the rich because they can afford it.
Yeah, I think that's always the case after a crisis like this, but especially in the current political milieu, I think that's certainly something we are going to see. Several states were already considering some income tax increases on the top rates. Those probably have become more likely now. States like Illinois, maybe for next year, Massachusetts, possibly Colorado, which currently has a single rate flat income tax, but that will be on the ballot. There are some other areas we may see that. New York and New Jersey, there have been proposals to increase rates that could very well happen. And we're also going to see, like, there's a financial transaction tax proposal in New Jersey. There's mark-to-market on capital gains proposal in New York. There's data tax proposals. There's a lot of these different things that are targeted at higher income and higher net worth individuals. Not all of these will go through. Some of them are not viable. Governor Cuomo in New York has expressed extreme concern, as has the budget director Rob Mujica, saying that this is going to drive people out of the state. And he has a really good point, especially because I think post-COVID-19, we are going to see a lot more mobility for high net worth and high income individuals than we did previously. A lot of people simply aren't going back to work in their normal work location. So suddenly tax laws around telework and mobile workforce, all of these come into play. New York's very aggressive on that. You could see the hedge funds and the boutique firms locating across the river, because suddenly that allows them to have people work wherever they want and not be exposed to a lot of these taxes. And that sort of mobility on labor as well as capital, because we've seen it on capital, but we're seeing it more on labor, especially, I think, as we transition to this much more digitally oriented approach to work, is going to be a significant issue that may be an impediment to states that want to drive tax rates up too far. There was a period in this country where you were very much tied to your job, and your job was tied to a very particular type of place. That's becoming less and less true, and we've accelerated that process dramatically with the current crisis and the experience of working remotely. So yes, states will try this, but the consequences may be more pronounced than they were in the past.
This will have to be the last question for all of you, but this is a good question from the audience. Should states use the current budget crisis as an opportunity to enact broader tax reform? And given the change in the economy, isn't this the time to maybe reform the tax systems as well? Catherine, Morgan, and then Jared, we'll kind of go down the line on your thoughts on that issue.
Sure. So I think it's worth noting that in the last several years, in a stable, much more stable fiscal environment, we have seen some states take steps to broaden their base and implement longer term tax reforms already. So, but I think you may see some of that happening. As Morgan talked about, we didn't see a lot of that during the Great Recession. Tax changes really were more targeted and largely temporary. And so it is possible that you'll see with some groundwork already laid in some states, that have had task force studying these types of things already. You could see some of that, but that takes a lot of time. And right now, states are facing, immediate budget shortfalls that need to be addressed that don't have that luxury of time too. So
For the short term, Morgan is outweighing the need for long-term reform.
Yeah, I think if states are able to do this thoughtfully and patiently, there is an opportunity. I think there's specifically an opportunity when states are facing some administrative challenges in their tax system. So I think it's possible. I don't know that I want to say they should. I think it could be challenging. Businesses are already facing these financial challenges, and then coupled with uncertainty in the tax code could make things more difficult. But if they're able to do it, like I said, thoughtfully and patiently and with input from all stakeholders, then it could be an opportunity. But that's easier said than done.
Always indeed. Politics plays a role. Jared, last thoughts.
I think both Catherine and Morgan are right that doing good base broadening and good comprehensive tax reform usually takes time. And unfortunately, some states are going to be hurried, which makes sense to start the conversations now so that when you actually have to make revenue changes, you can do it intelligently and don't do it at the last possible moment. There are some states that I think are clearly starting to look at some degree of base broadening as a way to raise revenue as opposed to rates or new taxes. And I think that makes sense as the incremental way. If you need new revenue, think about broadening the base. What I'd really say is think about right sizing the base, because you have this on both sides, especially again, as we become a much more mobile economy. You have the potential to double tax activity or punitively tax it, where multiple states are trying to get in on the same income or economic activity. That we want to avoid. That's not broadening the base, that is expanding it beyond a state's legitimate boundaries and double taxing. At the same time, however, as the way that we participate in the economy changes, some state tax codes are way behind. And they are simply not taxing activity where there's either nowhere income or there is just activity that is not subject to the tax base. Getting both sides of that equation right makes sense. That is better tax policy. It's more neutral. If there needs to be additional revenues, it's better to be approaching it towards providing neutrality in the tax code than targeting particular industries and activity. And just generally, that should be the long-term approach, that we fill in the gaps where the economy has outstripped the tax code, and we avoid the areas where it could lead to double taxation.
Well, great. Thanks to all three of you for some terrific comments. Great overview of the issues. Hopefully solutions in there as well. Great. Thank you for the first panel for a terrific program there. Thanks for all of you who have joined us this afternoon or today. You will be able to review or see the program again, the taped version, on our YouTube channel at YouTube/user/Tax Foundation. And you get to watch it as many times as you like in case you missed something along the way and didn't take notes. But thanks again to all of you for participating today and joining us, and look forward to the next edition of the Tax Foundation's Talking Tax webinars. We look forward to seeing you down the road.